Welcome back to another video inspired by Andy Edwards, and this one is the 10 greatest power trios of all time. So before we dive in, if you're new to my channel and you haven't already subscribed, please hit the button now. If you could also like and comment, I'd greatly appreciate it because it helps out my channel and it keeps me doing these videos. So Andy Edwards had a video out there in which he went through the top 10 power trios of all time in his opinion. So very good video, very informative, and it made me think, yeah, what would my top 10 power trios be of all time? So first, I suppose we should define what a power trio is. So generally, a rock band who are producing very high tempo, high energy music, and you would have a drummer, obviously, and then a bass player and a guitar player, and usually one of the bass player or guitar player sings as well. So they're only a three-piece band, but they're able to get this massive sound. Now there's a couple of considerations that I think we need to consider when we're talking about power trios. One of them is the studio recordings. So obviously you have power trios go into a studio and they can overlayer and overdub parts and make the sound absolutely huge. That's not a big deal. Then they come out sounding like a 5 or 6 or 7 piece band. You're using studio tricks to basically make your sound massive, and that's absolutely fine. Some bands like to keep a core of 3 people and then they like to do all the work in the studio and then go out live and perform it as a 5 or 6 piece. I'm trying to stay away from bands like that. So bands like Stereophonics, Feeder, Green Day, Blink-182, they're all 3 pieces essentially at their core, or they were, but then when they record songs they layer them. They put so many layers on top of them, and then when they go out live they can be a 4 or 5 piece band live. So I try to stay away from those types of bands. Plus I think the 10 bands I've chosen are better than those bands, and I've tried to focus more on the traditional bands that rock bands or metal bands, bands that really had something to say, something that was high energy, sounded really good, and that they performed as a 3-piece live. That's what I'm trying to get down to here. So as I was saying, the studio is one part, the live is the other part, and I'm looking for power trios who sound great live or who did it live for a long period of time. So that's I suppose considerations that we need to take into account when we're talking about power trios. Something else we need to consider is also the impact that the band had on music, whether it be culturally, or whether they had a massive influence on other bands, whether they've released classic albums, whether they're responsible for spearheading a movement. All those things feed into my ranking here. So I haven't done this in any sort of scoring or scientific method. I've just gone through the 10 bands and I've picked out CDs from each of those bands and I've just put them in a list from 10 up to 1 on what my favorite is. So please comment, let me know what your top 10 are, and if there's any bands on this list that you don't think deserve to be there, let me know in the comments. And if there's bands that I haven't mentioned or included but you think they should be on the list, please let me know as well. Okay, so we'll kick off with number 10, and I have Motorhead. Motorhead at number 10. Absolutely brilliant power trio, formed in the early 1980s I believe, after Lemmy left a band called Hawkwind, which were kind of like a prog band. Lemmy teamed up with Fast Eddie Clarke on guitar and Phil Filthy Animal Taylor on drums, and they formed Motorhead, and they were absolutely amazing, to be honest. There's a live album, No Sleep Till Hammersmith. If you like your rock and your metal, definitely go check that out. There's so many bands that influence that cite Motorhead as an influence, like Metallica, Megadeth. They're absolutely huge influence. Even Dave Grohl is a huge fan of Motorhead. So yeah, I think they definitely deserve a place on this list. They were very influential. They kept their core as a 3-piece. They didn't bother adding. I think they had one album where they had 2 guitar players, but they soon figured out that didn't work, and they dropped one of those guitar players to get back to a 3-piece. Right up until just before Lemmy passed away, they were still gigging as a 3-piece, still releasing albums which sounded raw. They didn't vary their sound a whole lot through their career. They're probably like a punk stroke heavy metal band, definitely in that genre. But yeah, I think Motorhead definitely deserve to be on this list, and that's why they are at number 10. Just take a quick drink here. I'm doing this one early in the morning, so yeah, a little bit thirsty. Okay, in at number 9, probably the most modern band on the list, it's Muse. Okay, so Muse have evolved from their early days as essentially a power trio, and one of the best power trios of all time, hence the reason they made the list. But basically, Muse used to go out, they obviously had bass and drums, so Chris, I forget his second name, begins with a W. He was on the bass, but his bass was a massively expanded sound on the bass. He used to use a lot of pedals and effects, certainly live, to get this big chunky sound. On drums, there was a guy called Dominic. Again, can't remember his second name. And then up front on guitars and keys and synths and all sorts of other instruments was, of course, Matt Bellamy. So yeah, fantastic band. Their earlier live performances, they performed as a 3-piece, but in recent years, I went to see them a number of years ago, and they actually perform as a 4-piece. So they've brought an additional musician on board with them. But to be honest, they still sound absolutely huge. They had some classic albums out in the early 2000s. This particular one is one of my favourite, Absolution, absolutely brilliant. They also had, before this, Origin of Symmetry, Black Holes and Revelations, absolutely. The Resistance is another great album by them. So yeah, absolutely fantastic band. Definitely deserve their place in this top 10 list. And probably a band that expanded their ideas massively in the studio and then tried to replicate that live. But they never really used backing tracks. I think they might now, or they're certainly getting help from another musician. But I know in their early days, they didn't really want to use backing tracks. They wanted to perform everything live. And going to a Muse show was absolutely huge. Like the sonic sound that they could get from the band, from a 3-piece, was absolutely phenomenal. So they're at number 9. Number 8. It's another one Andy had on his list, ZZ Top. Absolutely brilliant blues rock band from Texas. Absolutely classic band, no doubt about it. They were just brilliant. So again, a 3-piece. They had Billy Gibbons on guitar and vocals leading. Then they had Dusty Hill, who played bass and also sang. He passed away a few years ago. And on drums was the only guy in the band that didn't have a beard, and his name was Frank Beard. So ironic, you couldn't make this stuff up. But their big breakout album was Eliminator, which was released in 1983. But before that, they had fantastic blues rock albums like Tres Hombres and stuff like that. Absolutely brilliant band. Jimi Hendrix was actually a massive fan of Billy Gibbons' guitar playing. And even the Rolling Stones, again, huge fans of ZZ Top, and they toured with Rolling Stones back in the early days. But yeah, I think ZZ Top are absolutely amazing. A very underrated band, and as power trios go, absolutely fantastic. Had a chance to catch them a couple of years ago live in Donington. I've actually seen all these bands live at some point or another so far. So I've seen Muse live, I've seen Motorhead live, and I've seen ZZ Top. And ZZ Top are amazing, absolutely brilliant. They really put on a show. They've got great songs, so absolutely no problem going up and playing for an hour and a half. And yeah, I think they're brilliant, absolutely brilliant. Love ZZ Top. Okay, next band on the list is an interesting one, because they didn't make their name as a 3-piece. They made their name as a 4-piece with a twin lead guitar sound. But I'm going to go for the Mark I era of Thin Lizzy, back when it was just a 3-piece of Phil Lynott, Eric Bell and Brian Downey. They were a lot more psychedelic sounding. They had blues rock influences in there, like sounding very like Cream. They also had folk influences in there, as you'd expect from Thin Lizzy. But yeah, their first 3 albums. So there was Thin Lizzy, Shades of a Blue Orphanage, and this one, Vagabonds of the Western World. Absolutely fantastic stuff, like absolutely top drawer. Before they went on to conquer the world with the dual lead guitar sounds, this was Thin Lizzy at their core. So again, in the studio, they did a lot of work layering, because there was only a 3-piece. But then obviously when they went live, they were a little bit more stripped back and psychedelic. A lot of their stuff sounds a little bit like Cream meets, I don't know, Bob Dylan or the Rolling Stones. They're just a class band back at this time. The standout songs for me back in this time is a song like The Rocker. If you go check that one out, absolutely fantastic, and it absolutely rocks. And then of course everybody knows the hit Whiskey in the Jar, which I don't think was actually included on an album, but that was their big breakthrough hit in, I believe, 1973. But yeah, an absolutely fantastic band. Yeah, and this is a class album, Vagabonds of the Western World. Go check that one out if you haven't already. So they are at number 7. In at number 6, I think this is going to be a big surprise for a lot of people. It's Nirvana at number 6. I think a lot of people might have said that they should be higher up the list, but not in my opinion. Nirvana were a great band, absolutely brilliant. But I did a Nirvana ranking video, and like realistically, to me, their favourite albums are Nevermind, or my favourite albums are Nevermind and the MTV Unplugged. In Utero, not a big fan of the production. I don't really like Bleach too much. So, you know, I don't think Nirvana have enough material to be up there. I know they had a massive cultural impact and they had spearheaded the whole grunge movement. Absolutely, totally get that. There's so many young people now picking up and playing guitar as a result of Nirvana. Completely understand all that. But to me, as a power trio, I've seen a lot of footage of them live when they were a 3-piece, and like, I know Dave Grohl is a fantastic drummer, and you know Kurt can really shout it out, but like apart from that, it's not something musically that's blown me away. It's the energy, the raw passion that they have that's blown me away. But musicianship live, certainly not something that was driving that, you know. And then when we look at their studio arrangements, so when they got in the studio, Butch Vig produced this absolute masterpiece, Nevermind. There's so much overdubbing and overlayering that, you know, the same as other 3-piece bands, other power trios do in the studio. Completely get it. They're trying to make the sound as big as they can, and I think Kurt actually wanted to get away from that on a Neutro, and you can certainly hear a difference there. But yeah, for me, they just miss out on the top 5. So obviously Kurt Cobain on vocals and guitars, you had Chris Novoselic on bass, and Dave Grohl on drums. A class power trio, definitely one of the best power trios of all time, but just outside my top 5. Okay, in at number 5, The Police. Yeah, might be a surprise to some people that I like The Police. Usually I like more of the heavy rock stuff, but you just can't deny how good this band were. They started off as a kind of solo project that was called Clark Kent, that the drummer Stuart Copeland had, then evolved into Sting, and I think there was another guy on guitar who didn't know that many chords, as Sting once said. They brought in a very experienced guitar player in Andy Summers, and then it was Sting, Andy Summers and Stuart Copeland for, I don't know how many years they were together, 5 or 6 years. They released about 6 albums, and every single one of them is a classic. The musicianship level of this band was on a different level. They were heavily influenced by jazz and jazz fusion. They sort of fit into the new wave of what was happening at the time, with bands like the Pretenders and what was that band that released My Sharona? The Knack, was it? Yeah, I think it was the Knack. So they were lumped in with a lot of those types of bands. Talking Heads was another one as a new wave band, but to me they were far, way and above any of those other bands. Had their own unique style. They pulled on influences like ska, reggae, pop, rock, jazz fusion. Yeah, absolutely brilliant. And they became one of the biggest bands in the world. Again, in the studio, they threw everything. They threw the kitchen sink at everything. They overlayered with their vocals. Sting was really the primary singer in the band, but he had no problem overdubbing and harmonising his vocals, which sound absolutely amazing on all the records. And then in terms of guitars, they had no problem overlayering them. Sting was a multi-instrumentalist, and he had, you know, other elements that he brought in, keyboards, pianos, different things. And then of course you had Stuart Copeland, who he wasn't just a normal drummer. He like a fantastic percussionist, musician, absolutely brilliant. And I think this band, one of the best bands of all time. and when they played live, it was a different experience. That they weren't trying to trick people by playing backing tracks or bringing in an extra musician to try and fill out the sound. They basically just played what they played, and you got a live version of the studio recordings. And if you get a chance, they did a tour in 2007 or 2008, I believe. I think the recording from the Japanese leg of the tour is available on YouTube. It's high quality sound, high quality video, and it's like a proper recording. I think it was actually released as a DVD. But if you get a chance to have a look at that, it's absolutely fantastic. It will blow you away. A 3-piece band stripped back, playing these absolutely brilliant songs. And yeah, it's just the way it should be done. You know, if the musicians are good enough, you don't need all the extra tricks. And Police are one of those bands where the musicianship is high enough that they don't need the tricks, and they can just strip these songs back and play them live. Absolutely brilliant. And they had a massive impact on the music scene in the late 1970s and early 1980s. Okay, so we get to number 4 here. This is going to be a surprise to a lot of people, I think. It's Rory Gallagher. So Rory Gallagher started off in show bands in Ireland and then moved on to form a band called The Taste in Cork. And The Taste were a 3-piece band, obviously Rory on vocals and guitar, and then they had a bassist and a drummer. They had some fantastic albums and songs and went on to famously play the Isle of Wight festival. I have that version on DVD, and absolutely fantastic. They blew it away that day. Again, just this 3-piece of fantastic musicians going up on stage, stripped back and rocking it out. Then Rory decided, there was issues with the record label and stuff, and Rory decided he wanted to go out on his own. So he had full artistic direction. But I suppose the famous lineup that everybody knows from Rory Gallagher is the lineup that appeared on the Irish tour in 1974. And they had Lou Martin and Rod Diath, and they had, of course, Jerry McAvoy on bass and Rory Gallagher. So they were a 4-piece band, and that was kind of the stable Rory Gallagher band that lasted the whole way through the 1970s, 1980s. But this particular version, so this is Rory Gallagher live in Europe. I picked this up a couple of weeks ago. It's an absolutely fantastic album. I think it was only like €2 or €3. Well worth it. Absolutely brilliant. But on this particular version, this was released in 1972. Okay, so Rory only had, I think, 1 or 2 albums out at this stage. And the lineup for this one is Rory Gallagher on vocals, guitars, mandolin and harmonica, Jerry McAvoy on bass, and a guy called Wilgar Campbell on drums. And to me, this is absolutely fantastic. This is a 3-piece in their absolute element. They play some songs off the first album or two, but most of the material is covers or reworkings of other songs. But they are so tight as a 3-piece live. It sounds absolutely amazing. And I think that they definitely deserve to be up there as one of the best power trios of all time. So yeah, Rory Gallagher, for that period of time where he played in 3 pieces, he's coming in at number 4. Okay, we get down to the serious business now, the top 3. It's going to be very interesting. So, at number 3, we have the Jimi Hendrix Experience. Of course, Jimi Hendrix leading the band on guitars and vocals. Mitch Mitchell and Noel Redding backing him up. Absolutely brilliant band. This was actually the debut album by the band. Are You Experienced? It's absolutely fantastic. So again, talking about the studio, Jimmy had absolutely no problem overdubbing and overlaying things, vocals, different sounds. Worked with engineer Eddie Kramer around that time in the late 1960s, and they had no problem expanding the sounds to make these albums that Jimmy released with the Jimi Hendrix Experience sound massively sonic. They were very heavily influenced by what the Beatles did on Sgt. Pepper's in terms of being psychedelic, but also expanding the sounds to sound massive. And Jimi Hendrix certainly pushed the barriers in that regard. One of the best guitar players of all time, like certainly one of the most influential guitar players of all time. He had his own unique style. It was absolutely fantastic, the work that they produced over that short period of time. And then a fantastic rhythm section in Noel Redding and Mitch Mitchell. Absolutely brilliant. this band were class. And what you heard on the album was all these expanded versions of the songs that Jimi had in his head, but then when they went and played live, it was just a raw three-piece, very similar to what the Rory Gallagher band did early on. Three musicians playing it out, and absolutely fantastic. Well deserved of their place at number 3, and their impact both culturally and in the music industry was huge, absolutely huge. So well deserved in place at number 3 there for the Jimi Hendrix Experience. Coming in at number 2, one of my favourites, it's Cream. And they've got one of my favourite guitar players of all time, of course, Eric Clapton on guitar and vocals. They've got Ginger Baker on drums, and on bass is Jack Bruce. And also Jack Bruce sung a lot in this band. Basically the cream of musicians at the time when they got together. I think it was late 1966. The Beano album had just been released. Eric wasn't really happy in that band, and he decided to move on to Cream. They released, I think it was only like 3 albums and a live album, something like that. But that body of work over that 2-3 year period from 1966 to 1968, 1969 is absolutely fantastic. Brilliant. This is the album I have here. It's Israeli Gears. It's one of their best. It's got class songs on it such as Sunshine of Your Love, Strange Brew, Tale of Brave Ulysses, Outside Woman Blues. Absolutely brilliant. A brilliant album altogether. So in the studio, Cream really stuck to a very simple format. They had bass, drums and guitars. You might have had guitars over dubbed and layered. You also might have had additional instrumentation here and there, but they kept it quite simple in the studio. It was all about the power and the rock and the energy, virtuosity, all that type of stuff. Then when they went and played live, they played different arrangements of the songs. Eric Clapton was very much an improvisational guitar player, which means he'd record a couple of takes of a solo, for example, in the studio. They'd pick the best one. That's what would go on the record, but you'd never hear that again. He never played a solo the same again. The next night they could be playing a gig live, and he would actually improvise, play the solo completely separate, completely differently to how he had played it before. And that was a charm and something that was absolutely brilliant with what they did. But yeah, Cream were phenomenal. Particularly Eric Clapton at this time. He was really getting into singing as a lead vocalist, and his guitar solos in Cream are absolutely fantastic. And his guitar tone as well. He really embodied the Gibson and Marshall combination. He used famously Gibson ES335s and Gibson SGs with Cream, Les Pauls a little bit. But yeah, he was able to get this fantastic woman tone, they call it, which was a really, really dark, heavy tone on the guitar, and it influenced so many other bands, you know, such as Black Sabbath and countless others. So yeah, I think absolutely brilliant. Cream definitely deserved their place at number 2 of the top 10 power trios of all time, in my opinion. Okay, coming in at number 1, I think a lot of people are going to be surprised at this one. It's going to be Rush. Yeah, I know. Prog rock band from Canada. Absolutely brilliant in my opinion. And the longevity that they had, I think is one of the reasons why they deserve to be here. So they formed in the, I think it was the late 1960s, maybe early 1970s, as a 3-piece with Geddy Lee on vocals and bass, Alex Lifeson on guitar, and on drums a guy called John Rutsey. They released their first studio album, which is brilliant. It's a heavy rock album, sounds very like Led Zeppelin, something like that. And then John Rutsey couldn't tour. He had health issues, so he left the band, and in came Neil Peart, and from there on it was just a different story. They started getting heavily influenced by more of the progressive rock bands like Yes and King Crimson. They just started to expand their sound. They went through a number of different albums. There was Fly By Night and Caress of Steel. They had a lot of experimentation on those albums, still really, really good, but they were going down a path that the record company weren't too happy with. And then they released 2112. And 2112 just blew the gates off, pushed them into the stratosphere, and it was just a different level that the band were at then. actually kept on the record label because of that album. They were going to be dropped if that album ended up being a flop, but it didn't. So they get into expanding their music to 20 minutes on one side of vinyl, which was something Pink Floyd had done and something Led Zeppelin had done. So they started to bring that in, and yes, of course, obviously, King Crimson and Jethro Tull. So they were very heavily influenced by the prog scene, and they just took the bull by the horns in terms of what they were doing. It was prog rock, but it was also heavy rock, hard rock, whatever you want to call it. They had massive extended guitar solos. Most of their songs were based around riffs, which was fantastic. Neil Peart, obviously a fantastic drummer. Geddy Lee, brilliant bass player. And then they started, as they got into the 1980s, they started to expand their sound. Keyboards started coming into it. Still good stuff in my opinion. I wouldn't diss it. There's a lot of brilliant albums there from the 1980s and into the 1990s, but certainly a different vibe, and that's what they were going for. They were trying to do something different, something maybe more with the times, and then they came back in the 2000s with some fantastic albums. Clockwork Angel being probably the most notable one, and yeah, they were touring right up until 5 or 6 years before Neil passed away. But there's some great DVDs out there. There's the R30 and the R40 DVDs, which are fantastic if you want to see a brilliant rock band. They didn't do the whole when they were live, they didn't do backing tracks. It was Geddy Lee had pedals and Alex had pedals, so they didn't even play to a click track. Basically they would be playing along the songs, and at a certain point in time Geddy would be able to press the pedals while he was still playing bass, and you would get the synth part would play. So it was as live as you can get, and probably one of the most explosive power trios live of all time. Absolutely brilliant. Very accomplished musicians, great songs. What can I say? This is just Rush are the best power trio of all time in my opinion, hands down, and I think they beat off the competition that were on this list. But I'd be very interested to hear what's your top 10 power trio of all time, or is there anyone on the list that you believe shouldn't be on the list? Please let me know in the comments below. And again, if you could like, subscribe, hit the notification bell, all that stuff helps out my channel and I greatly appreciate it. And I will talk to you on the next one. Bye for now.